Good evening. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Casa Italiana zerilli-marimo at New York University. My name is Eugenio Refini. I'm the chair of the Department of Italian Studies, and I'm really delighted to be welcoming you tonight for a very special event. We have a special guest. I will introduce him in a second. I just would like to thank Casa Italiana, as usual, for being such an amazing partner in crime when we come up with events, even sort of last minute. And I would like to thank, of course, Stefano Albertini, the director of Casa Italiana, who wasn't able to make it tonight, but he's greeting you all, as usual, even from a distance. And I would like to thank, of course, Julian Sachs, who's taking care of the technology, and many, many more things around here. So tonight we are hosting what was announced as a conversation, but really we are going to have the luxury of a real talk, and I'm really happy about that. And this is going to be a presentation by Professor Emanuele Coccia. Emanuele is currently a visiting professor at NYU in the Department of French. When we discovered a few months ago that he was about to come to New York, and I wish to thank my colleague Emily Apter, when earlier in the fall of 2024 she mentioned this visit, we thought, let's find a way to bring him to Casa Italiana as well, to do something with us. And then, of course, the follow-up question was, what would we be doing with Emanuele? Because, of course, Emanuele wears many hats, and there's, quite a wide range of things we would be able to ask him to do. So we had a conversation over Zoom before Christmas, and I sort of took the opportunity to ask him to talk about one of his books in particular, or better, to revisit a topic which is at the core of one of his books, which have been extremely influential for me and extremely interesting for my own work. So I hope you don't mind if I took this particular liberty of sort of picking one topic among the many which Emanuele has been exploring. And the topic of this conversation tonight is going to be Metamorphosis, which is really the title of a book which Emanuele published. The book is available in multiple languages. It came out in French, in Italian, of course, in English. I have the English here, Metamorphosis, very beautiful cover. And I think we will be hearing about insects and plants and flowers and many more things tonight. But let me introduce briefly Emanuele. And I say briefly because, of course, there will be so many things to say about him. So I will try to keep this introduction as short as possible. Emanuele is a philosopher and an associate professor at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. He received his PhD in Florence and was formerly a professor of history of philosophy in Freiburg, Germany. His training as a PhD student was in medieval studies, and he's the author of a very important, we were talking about this book earlier, a very important book on Averroes and Averroism in medieval philosophy. The beautiful title of this book was La trasparenza delle immagini, Averroè e l'Averroismo, so the transparency of images, which I really find a very stimulating title for what is a very important book in the field. But then over the following years, his work has been moving into other territories. Some of the titles of Emanuele's books are as follows: La vie sensible, The Life of Plants, Metamorphoses, and more recently, Philosophie de la Maison. His books in Italian are published by Bruno Mondadori, Il Mulino, Einaudi, among others. He recently participated in the making of animated videos. He's very much into the visual arts as well, which is a very important part of what he does, both as an author and as a philosopher, as a thinker. I will mention here Quercus from 2020 with Forma Fantasma, Heaven in Matter 2021 with Fei Formisano, and The Portal of Mysteries 2022 with ... In 2019, he took part in the Trees exhibition held at the Cartier Fondation for Contemporary Art in Paris. And he edited the catalogue of the 23rd Triennale di Milano, Unknown Unknowns, An Introduction to Mysteries. And I would argue that mysteries have to do with metamorphoses as well, which is the topic, as I said, of the presentation which we are going to listen to tonight. So please join me in welcoming Emanuele Coccia to the podium.
the slides. Sorry. Yeah. So thank you so much. Thank you, Jenny, for this generous presentation. And thank you, Emily, again for inviting me in New York. It's such a beautiful opportunity. So I want to start with asking you for a sort of hermeneutic charity. I'm always very embarrassed about having to think and to talk about my past. My past life is a huge storage full of objects, experiences that I've never put in order, and I'm always more curious about what will happen to me the day after tomorrow than about what happened to me decades ago. And receiving an invitation to talk about a book that came out 5 years ago, it's a bit like receiving a friend request on social media from a childhood friend who wants to rediscover the intimacy that our lives could not share anymore, and whom I've no desire to see again, because the only destiny of such a new encounter would be to ruin the vague but pleasant memory that I haven't dusted off for years. The same happens with books in general. And I've always have a strange feeling. The past no longer belongs to me. It has become a landscape that is as foreign to me as a city that I haven't visited for a long time. But out of my friendship for Eugenio, I've accepted to reopen that drawer and will try to understand what I can do today with what I wrote and I was yesterday. So, referring to an ancient biological tradition that dates back to the European Renaissance and through Goethe comes to contemporary biology, the idea of the book was extremely simple. I wanted to describe the status of what we call life, starting from the paradigm of what entomologists call autometabolous insects. That is, the insects that undergo a radical transformation of their body's anatomy and physiology during their lifetime. The cause and the occasion of this radical change is due to their particular anatomical organization. Insects, as you know, don't have an internal skeleton, and it's their skin, which is more like the shell of a car, that gives them solidity and structure. And for this reason, every time they grow, they have to get rid of their skin and rebuild it. And some of them take the opportunity to completely rebuild their anatomy. Now, there is something strange about a caterpillar transforming into a butterfly. So, the caterpillar is a collection of enormous digestive tubes that drags itself along the ground and spends its day eating as if nature were one big McDonald's, whereby the butterfly is an obsessive satyr who has forgotten that it has to feed and has only one thing on its mind: having sex all the time. One leaves clinging to the ground, the other flies. And according to biology, it's precisely to prevent adults and children from living in the same world and therefore competing that they develop such radically different forms. There is something fascinating and liberating in this evidence. Thanks to Metamorphosis, the same self, the same ego, is capable of living in two bodies that cannot be harmonized, are defined by two opposite moral identities, and is at home in two incompatible worlds. This was what interested me above all. Insects teach us that life cannot be reduced to a single anatomical and ethological or ecological identity. Instead, it is always what allows us to pass from one phase to another, from one ethos to another, from one word to another. And vice versa, morphological, ecological, and ethical discontinuity is not capable of fracturing the substantial unity of life, even from a psychological point of view. So starting from this evidence, the book tries to demonstrate that the metamorphic structure of living being is not only typical of the class of insects, but of any species. And metamorphosis is not just the name of the relationship that every living being has with itself, but also the relationship that exists between generations of individuals belonging to the same species. Metamorphosis is also the structure of the relationship that, starting from Darwin, biology must be able to consider between species. That's the point of Darwin's theory. Every species has nothing original, it's just the modification of a form that has already existed. It's literally the butterfly of the precedent caterpillar species. So finally, metamorphosis, the structure of the relationship that all living beings have with the earth. Life in its totality is nothing more than the butterfly of this enormous caterpillar that is Gaia. It's the metamorphosis of this planet. Now, the universality of this structure, often not visible, is the immediate effect of an extremely trivial fact to which, however, we pay very little attention. The fact that every living beings, regardless of the species to which they belong, must be born in order to exist. Put this way, it would seem a kind of tautology, yet it is not. First of all, birth is the most universal fact of life, and the quality that distinguishes the living being from the non-living beings. Only those who live are born, and the other way around, to such an extent that the word nature, as you know, comes from the Latin verb for be born, nasci. Nature is just a recollection of those who are born. Now, being born is not synonymous with existing. On the contrary, being born means that in order to exist, one is forced to borrow, to use a body, or better, a flesh that is already alive. Each of you didn't begin to exist in a portion of virgin matter. You took some flesh from your mother and father. In short, because of birth, all living beings are second-hand lives, recycled and used molecules, desperately trying to give this flesh another form, another destiny, another place in the world. Because of birth, all living things are forced to have a metamorphic relationship with their own flesh, with their own stranger identity. Like insects, we are forced to transform what others were, used to feel and experience and used to think into what we are. And because of birth, metamorphosis is not a passive phenomenon, but the active attitude, the agency that transforms everything that is in front of us, within us, and that's around us. This obligation to individually and actively exercise metamorphosis also takes place in reproduction. What we call sex in biology is the evidence that individuals of an immense number of species, in order to prolong their own existence, must mix their genes with those of another individual, hybridizing their own identity. As you know, sex and reproduction do not coincide. There are cases of sex that does not correspond to the generation of the third individual or to multiplication, but only serves to transform the individuals that take part in it. Let's take the example of Paramecium aurelia, so a ciliate protist capable of approaching another specimen of the same species in order to have sex, which is to diversify. It works like that. One individual approaches the other, and they exchange genes. It is as if when we go to a party, we can approach someone, take their air, give them our nose, take their voice, give them our eyes. That's what sex is. The ability to take on the characteristics of the other and to live by mixing our genes in the other person's body. Sexual reproduction is just this form of mutual plastic surgery spaced out in the body by a third to suffer less. After all, this means that the ultimate purpose of love is never the care of individuality, of the individuality of the others, but the attempt to mix the two identities to radically change our own, to enter the life of the other and desire to have the life of the other in us. And what life seeks through love is this, to have the life of the other within oneself. This is why traditional ecology, which aims at the conservation of heritage, makes no sense. Species meet and coexist because they try to enter into each other, and this mutual penetration of identity is the greatest love that can be given. We never think about that, but after all, due to the fact that we are all the result of this technology of transforming the self and the other, due to the fact that we are, at least for us human, the result of sexual reproduction, each of us is the almost geological sedimentation of the love of lives and forms that we have never known. We are the form of this love, only expressed in the third person, which we will never be able to experience. Life is only the echo of this love that has become geology, and species are fossil of an ancestral pleasure in mixing their genes. And like volcanoes, however, we cannot help but try to repeat this love linked to a strange transformation of all bodies. All species do nothing but desperately seek this transformation. Metamorphosis, however, is not only the structure of the biological reality of life, it's also the form of our psychic life. It has been little emphasized, but that Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, physician, great reader of the biology of his time, and strongly influenced by that, drew the entire diagram of human psychological life according to this same theoretical tradition of metamorphic biology. As is well known, the intuition that drives all his work is the idea that the ultimate structure of subjectivity is not defined by our ability to know, but our ability to love. We are subject for Freud because we can love, not because we can know something. And of course, it changes everything. We are a self, we have an ego, we can refer to ourselves as distinct from others, not because we know the world, but because we can relate to it only through love. Love is this disconnection from ourselves that we have confused with self-awareness. Precisely for this reason, however, for Freud, love has no cognitive purposes. It doesn't serve to know a reality. Indeed, it is often indifferent to the true nature of the world and of the loved object, and it does not even the function of aggregation as the Platonic doctrine suggested. It doesn't serve to unite two subjects, but to shape a self starting from the transformation of the self of others. Unlike the body of the insects, our soul needs to go through multiple transformations, as if we could never stop transforming the caterpillars of our daily experience into butterflies. This is because the matter we must mold to transform ourselves into a self is not inside us, but outside us, in the world. Actually, to be born means to have lost the subjectivity, the ego that sustained us during pregnancy, and to be forced to ask the world for this kind of psychological replacement, for this psychological flesh through which we have to build a new ego. The caterpillar, that the cocoon of our consciousness transformed into the butterfly of our ego, are always and only the consciousness of others, the ego of others. And love is the force that allows us to include them in our psychological life. But precisely because the matter of our consciousness always lies outside us and can be repeatedly lost, psychic life needs to go through multiple metamorphoses. Freud called this original energy libido. It's like the Latin word for desire. And it's present following him from the first moment of every human being's life, and it's indifferent to this distinction between spiritual love and sex, but also between object and subject, and it's able of integrating and transforming whatever is in front of us. And in order to understand how does it work, how libido is working, Freud is looking at the same kind of method of the natural science. And in natural sciences, as you know, it's error that allows us to recognize the truth. And in psychology, it's uneasiness that makes the physiology of love more visible. This is why it's by observing the elements of melancholia, the pathological reaction to the loss of loved one that causes the lovers to lose their sense of self-esteem or to develop a deep hatred for themselves, that Freud suggests that all love is in reality a process of identification. Loving in its most original and universal form does not mean recognizing the diversity of the person in front of us, but being seized by the physical and psychic mania of transforming oneself into this beloved object. We want to become and to be the beloved object, to replace it in everything. I'm quoting Freud. This is what Freud called identification. Precisely because this dynamic now has nothing to do with knowledge, it turns indifferently to the body or to parts of the body, subjects, consciousnesses, without ever reaching complete inclusion. In order to be able to say, I, myself, we are forced to love what lives, feels, thinks, imagines outside of us, but precisely because j'ai est un autre, precisely because this external psychic life that we introject will always be partial and never identical to its source and to ourselves, we are forced to transform it and to transform ourselves, to make our soul the site of a relentless psychic battery. That's why, that is what psychoanalysis says happens in the very first stages of our lives. Newborns, as soon as they leave the mother womb, identify with the mother, or rather with a part of the mother bodies that coincides with a part of the world that guarantees their existence, the breast. And it's this identification that guarantees them to feel the feeling of well-being and reality, sort of bubble of milk and pleasure. And it's because identification can only be partial that it can never be complete, and every act of love is essentially ambiguous. If loving means identify with loved ones, loving is also the experience of an alienation. We become something other than ourselves, and our ego becomes a stranger to us. And every love simultaneously generates affection and hatred towards the one who takes on the face of a true invader. Even in the more adult phase, love is the continuation of this movement. What changes is that, unlike what Freud calls the oral phase, we learn not to destroy the loved object. But there is an aspect of negativity that remains. Identifying with the loved one always means establishing them as an ideal. If we identify with a person we love and we try to become like them, then suddenly this person becomes a model from which to start transforming ourselves. And this is in this dialectic that Freud discovered the Oedipus complex and the genesis of superego. I will skip some part because it's like clear for everybody to think about this. Because of this fact, love is always the cause of a psychological fracture. In a way, unlike insects, we cannot free ourselves from the exuvia of past loves, which form the flesh of our consciousness, and that's why the ego is always divided. Freudian doctrine, which has inspired much of the European and American culture, is not totally original. Florentine Neoplatonic culture, the source of much of classical Renaissance Italian and French painting, had already reached similar conclusion. It was above all Marsilio Ficino, a very weird, interesting, strange kind of philosopher, poet, translator, who used to live at the Medici court in Florence, who suggested these similar ideas in a commentary on Plato's Symposium. Every lover, it says in a passage of this book that he wrote in honor of the death of the Greek philosopher, so every lover carves the figure of the beloved into his soul. Amans amati figuram suum, sculpting in animo. This is a very beautiful idea because it describes every love as a transfiguration of your own face, but also because it makes love and technology and love and art identical. From this point of view, the lover and the beloved in a reciprocal relationship are two artifacts, two artworks, no less artificial than a smartphone or a building. To love means to transform oneself and the other, or the other into a cyborg, to sculpt oneself and force the other to sculpt yourself, like a block of marble or wood. We come from 2 centuries of toxic romanticism that has made us believe that love is always a place of natural spontaneity a movement towards the nature of the beloved and the expression of an original, wild, and unknowable nature. To love would not only be to adhere to oneself, but to adhere to the most natural form of oneself. And yet, it would be enough to look through a little ancient mythology to remember that there has never been a sphere in which the artificial and artificiality have been more present. You know the stories, potions, artifice, spells, necessary to fall in love and to make others fall in love. Love is the space of denaturation since ever, and above all of metamorphosis. Think of Ovid's Ars Amandi. So the very famous Latin work, but the title has been, almost never translated, because if you have to translate on the technology of love. And the beginning of the book is eloquent. I'm translating the first verses. If any of you are unfamiliar with the technology of love, read this book. After reading it, you will be a great love technician. With technology, boats with sails and oars move quickly. With technology, chariots are made more agile, and therefore it's with technology that love must be guided. Venus has made me a great engineer of tenderness. Very beautiful. So Ovid, in a way, is the first great Hawaiian in history. Love is a cyborg technology. To love is to be an engineer of one one's life and that of the others. Love is not a form of museum-like respect for the identity of the beloved. It's not a formalin or an archive of the life of others or yourself. Love is a process of mutual metamorphosis. To be loved means to be open to the metamorphic will of the other. It means to lend oneself to the artistic or plastic ambition of the other for one's own body and life. Being open to the possibility of being cut, of having to change color, gait, way of speaking. And if we need someone to love us so much, it's not because we want to be known, but because we need someone to transform us into something better, perhaps, without having the ability to do so by ourselves. To love is to need someone who is a cocoon that allows us to go from caterpillar to butterfly. And it's for the same reason that it's always so dangerous. Those who love us can transform us and make us worse, psychologically massacre us, makes us go back to being caterpillars when we were already butterflies. It was to the same line of doctrine that Claude Levi-Strauss, the greatest theorist of cultures of the last century and the father of structural ethnography, was inspired during his stays in New York. As you know, Levi-Strauss spent 10 years almost here. At the center of this theory is the fundamental intuition that every culture expresses itself mainly through the stories it tells. What Levi-Strauss kept called the stories myths in the 19th century language of the time. But a myth, that's the point of his doctrine, a myth actually has no semantic or rhetorical autonomy. It's always the metamorphosis, the transformation, this is the technical term that Levi-Strauss adopts, of a previous or of a parallel myth belonging to another culture. This is why cultures can only be understood through a form of comparison. You can never understand a culture by itself. You have to compare that to another culture because every culture is the transformation of other cultures. Mythical thought, he writes at the end of the fourth volume of his huge Mythology, is essentially transformative. Each myth, as soon as it is born, is modified by changing narrators, whether within the tribal group or by spreading from people to people. Certain elements fall away, others replace them, sequences are inverted, the distorted structure goes through a series of states whose successive alterations nevertheless preserve the character of the group. End of quote. Against the romantic Herderian legacy that reduced culture to mere folklore and recognized in cultural system the immediate and direct expression of a phantom popular spirit, Levi-Strauss introduced three important innovations. First, there is no originality in cultures. Every people borrows stories, ideas, elements from other cultures with which they identify and which they are therefore obliged to transform, actually. One could give 1,000 examples of this fact, not only in the non-written cultures that Levi-Strauss studied, but also in the Mediterranean cultures that are studied here at NYU. One need to recall the Platonic myths. I mean, Renaissance is just this phenomenon. People that studied in Florence to think that they were Greeks, like totally crazy guys. One need to recall the Platonic myth about the debt of Greek culture to Egyptian culture, or the secondary and derivative character of all Roman literature, which is often simply a copy, literally a copy or a rewriting of the Greek model. But there is a striking example that demonstrates Levi-Strauss' thesis in very, very simple form. It's the structure of the Christian Bible. What we call Christianity is only a transformation in the technical sense, in Levi-Straussian sense, of the myths of the Second Temple Judaism. And the first Christian legislators were so aware of the impossibility of understanding the first Christianity without, like Judaism, that in defining the normative canon of the new religion, the Bible, they felt obliged to include also the canon of the other religion. If you think about that, the Christian Bible it's an hybrid. It's very strange, the fact that in order to read the gospel, you have to read the normative text that the gospel had just, in a way, made useless. But this is exactly what Levi-Strauss was trying to prove. Every culture is always a second-hand culture, a culture that recycles and forms other cultures, contemporary or older. There is no cultural identity, and there is no possible purity, nowhere, even in indigenous gates. For every people, looking to the past means discovering that they are, in a way, hybridized. They are the product of borrowing and mixing. In this way, Levi-Strauss models a position that is simultaneously opposed to the ethnic or nationalist identitarianism of 19th century anthropology and to young pan-cultural universalism, which imagined that the human mind is sculpted by a series of transcendental and super-historical or supercultural archetypes. It seems to me more than urgent to remember and return to this position today, now that the myths of ethnic neo-romanticism have taken almost the entire cultural and political world hostage, to the point of considering culture as ontologically separate, autonomous, and distinct units since the dawn of time. And it's important to remember that while it's right to condemn transformation that have coincided with forms of violence, fighting these forms of injustice by evoking the spectre of a cultural purity of some non-Western peoples, as the current debate of cultural appropriation often does, is a form of neocolonialism and also a very dangerous mistake for which we are beginning to pay the price. The second novelty is that if no culture is original, it's because known is the immediate manifestation of a popular will, and therefore it can never be the place where a people reaches a perfect self-awareness. If every myth is the transformation and the metamorphosis of an alien myth, then every culture can reach a perfect self-awareness only through another culture, and vice versa. By knowing itself, it will above all know other culture. Myth is the expression of complete form of rationality, but rationality that beats culture and their myths is that of Freudian identification, metamorphosis, metamorphic sex of or hybridation. One always thinks through and starting from the ideas of others. Thirdly, third innovation, for a culture to be alive, it must be able to radically modify its present state. This is because, I'm quoting Levi-Strauss, each discontinuous change requires the organization of the whole. It never occurs alone, but in correlation with other changes. There is never a statistical, gradual, purely quantitative change, but a succession of radical discontinuities, just in the passage from a caterpillar to butterfly. For this reason, ethnography replaces quantitative rigor with qualitative rigor. So that means that, in a way, cultural discourse, so published novels, buildings designed by architects, works of art, political discourse, fashion shows, museum exhibitions, people's daily behavior, food cooked every day, and so on, all those cultural objects or facts are always the site of the structural metamorphosis of a culture, and never that of its preservation. Now, the operation of the ethnographic comparison is anything but neutral. By relating culture that had never touched to each other, it cannot help but mix them again. To understand that, it's good to return for a moment to the source of the idea of Levi-Strauss transformation. In an autobiographical book of conversation with Didier Ribon, when asked about the main inspiration of the doctrine, Levi-Strauss denies that the source was logic or linguistics, and he says that his inspiration came from, I'm citing, a work that played a decisive role for me and that I read during my stay in the United States, so here in New York. And the work is On Growth and Form in 2 volumes by Darcy Wentham Thompson, first published in 1917. I'm still quoting Levi-Strauss. The author is a Scottish naturalist, interpreted with the visible differences between animal or plant species or organs with the same genus as transformation. It was an epiphany. Especially as I was soon to realize that this way of seeing things was part of a long tradition. Behind Thompson was Goethe's botany, and behind Goethe was Albrecht Dürer with his treatise on the proportions of the human body. And he says, it was since the beginning of my childhood that I was fascinated by botany and zoology. By studying I'm quoting Darcy Thompson, the interrelations of growths and forms, and the part with which certain of the physical forces play in this complex interaction, Darcy Thompson had tried to apply, I'm quoting him, mathematical methods and mathematical terminology in order to describe and define the forms of organism, end quote. The result was a sort of lysergic version of the morphology of living beings, the science that Goethe had tried to re-establish, but in which a historical or evolutionary approach is replaced. I mean, in Darcy Thompson's version, the historical approach is replaced by the idea of a field of infinite variation. The living organism represents or occupies a field of forces which is never simple and which, as a rule, is of immense complexity. So rather than thinking about the autonomy or genealogy of all forms, Darcy Thompson thinks about their perpetual translatability through infinite mechanism of deformation or permutation, which makes it impossible to define an original and standard type. Darcy Thompson gives a very clear example. Using the Cartesian coordinate systems, he explains that, I'm quoting him, the problem is closely akin to that of the cartographer who transfers identical data to one projection or another, and whose object is to secure a complete correspondence in each small unit of the area between the one representation and the other. Now, that's the important, beautiful point. The morphologist will not seek to draw his organic forms in a new and artificial projection, but in the converse aspect of the problem, he will inquire whether two different but more or less obviously related forms can be so analyzed and interpreted that each may be shown to be a transformed representation of the other. So the idea is that every form can be transformed in the other. That this method separates the morphology of living things from taxonomic cladistics, which consider transformation only in an historical and unidirectional sense. For this reason, Darcy Thompson says that by the combined actions of appropriate forces, any material form can be transformed into any other. Just as out of a shapeless mass of clay, the potter of the sculpture models his artistic product. Now, this aspect is important because it shows that ethnography is not a simple representation of metamorphic phenomena. It's basically a further metamorphosis that makes different cultures translatable. It is as if, thanks to ethnography, we could finally make caterpillars and butterflies equivalent and simultaneously in the same body. But there's more. In a much-discussed book, Roy Wagner, so the anthropologist, emphasized how every anthropologist invents the culture he believes he's studying or she's studying. Because, I was quoting, it's not. Because they are translating one culture into the other, and in this way they are modifying both. Every ethnographic act is a dual invention, according to Wagner, but also sort of an intercultural sex. A bit like the parameter I was mentioning at the beginning, which together make both cultures thinkable through each other and modify them irreparably. After all, bringing two cultures into contact already means altering their destiny. If we must look to the long history of the theory of metamorphosis to find our psychology or our ethnography, we must also look at it found our practices of conceiving and preserving the apparently disordered but coherent and rational ensemble of writings, images, symbols, material, and immaterial production that we call still today culture. It's through metamorphosis that we should learn to rethink universities, museums, and cultural institutions. Allow me to conclude this speech with some examples looking to the future. We live in a world that has created platforms that allow peoples to communicate, to introduce ideas, symbols, and concepts into each other. Of course, this exchange is not balanced. It's nothing like a fair trade ritual. But the result of these world technologies is that for the first time in human history, a form of trans-ethnic and trans-cultural continuity has been created, which means that the whole world shares similar references, ideas, and questions in real time, even if each people or minority gives different answers. And social media, in a way, is a theory of the conjunction and circulatory combination of all cultures. An open-air museum that perpetually overturns the history of all peoples and reinterprets it. It is as if a space has been created in which all the paramecia of the planet never ceases to exchange genes. All those bacteria are like... In the long run, this process has produced a single planetary culture. It's useless and even hypocritical in the face of this reality to complain about the effects of homogenization or to preach a return to autonomous and impermeable pre-modern cultures. After what has happened, there is no longer a culture linked to a single people or a single territory. There is only one bastardized, impure lingua franca, of which everyone has now become a speaker. It's useless to continue talking about French, Italian, or American culture, but also Yanomami, Inuit, or other First Nations. All of humanity today has one single, very heterogeneous, jagged, immensely diversified, but continuous and unitary culture. Humanity can be divided politically, but not culturally. Cultures are, at least now, spaces of mixtures, hybridation, and not of an ontological division. Universities and museums need to be at this level, this situation. Instead of preserving the fetishes of the 20th century political distinction, in a time when most of the nations of the traditional geopolitical chessboard are deteriorating into the forms of legalized organized crime, it is necessary to assert the will and the need to speak this new lingua franca, which belongs to no one, and which no one can claim, because it's in a state of perpetual transformation, in the act of constantly exchanging one's genes, of changing one rules, one canons. Instead of continuing to prolong the waste of 20th century culture and its cost, we could imagine universities and museums as laboratories of this new cultural cocoon that never stops unraveling archives, deforming the DNA of our current cultures to pour them into a perpetual flow of metamorphosis and be able to imagine a common future. From this point of view, museums can perhaps represent a virtuous model. Museums are places where the ordinary space-time of cities is suspended for a few months. Objects, forms, and symbols that are usually used in everyday life and have precise meanings are placed in the same frame, as if to allow each of them to exert its alchemical potential on the other, transforming them, once again, into a sort of cultural paramecium that exchanges its genes. Sorry, I'm obsessed with this idea of paramecia. But unlike the university, where the privileged medium is that of the word, so the verbals, like what I'm doing now, or of the representation, again, in the museum, it's reality itself that suddenly becomes a symbol of itself and of the world which it belongs. Precisely because they are themselves a part of the world, the object transforms the space-time of the exhibition into an act of localization and of the world reflections on itself. It becomes a museum. It's a space where the reality itself becomes like a self-consciousness of itself. This is why, by the way, the white box is necessary. It's quite stupid to critique today again the white box. The white box is necessary because we need to reduce noise, to make the murmur of the things and of the world more audible. The museum is a strange exercise in controlled animism. The objects gathered in front of the spectator become a sort of collective and shared spirit that speaks to the spectator. And by becoming reality and its distorted consciousness at the same time, a museum managed to change culture in a much more radical way than other cultural institutions. We should try to invent new institutions, a sort of museum university where all disciplines from all the people of the earth never cease to dissolve the body caterpillar of culture to create the butterfly of the future. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, well, this was fantastic. Is it working? Yeah. Yes, great. Thank you, Emanuele. Wow, I don't know where to start. I have notes here. So, because really I think maybe we can begin by, just gathering a few thoughts, and thank you for really sort of taking up this invitation of revisiting your work on Metamorphoses, because I think you did a wonderful job at not only illustrating some of the core ideas in the book, but also moving forward and thinking about what this concept means to you at this point in your work, and also sort of highlighting what can come next. I think your book really ends already with a discourse about future, which I found extremely compelling. But I think the last part of your talk today really brings it to yet another level. This idea of thinking about cultural institutions as places where change can happen, and of course, change is yet another sort of synonym of what Metamorphosis is about. I would like just to share a couple of thoughts, which are, of course, very dear to my own thinking, and then we can, of course, hear more from you, and we will then open it to Q&As from the audience. One theme which strikes me is that of the way in which you talk about time. Because, of course, one of the reasons why I wanted you to talk about Metamorphosis is because I'm interested in that concept, but also as a scholar of, reception, whatever that means. Metamorphosis is an interesting concept to me because it allows me to bring together questions of language. Of course, translation is a big part of what I do, and it does have to do with Metamorphosis as well. But more broadly, I keep asking myself how we can relate to things in the past. And of course, reception studies as a field has a huge debate about how we can interact with the past. And your very first statement, the past does not belong to us, I found it extremely compelling and interesting, because some of the sources I've been working on really show a similar anxiety about how we relate to the past. And quite often, I'm thinking in particular of some early 20th century sources, quite often the response is the opposite. There's this idea of sort of registering or recording the past as something embedded into us. There is a beautiful quote which came to my mind listening to you by this author whom I'm working on, Vernon Lee, who wrote at the very beginning of the 20th century a play, and then one of the characters obsessed with the relationship between past and present. At some point she says, just before committing suicide, the past belongs to me. And this kind of obsession with the past is what brings her to the verge and actually to the actual act of committing suicide. So, kind of long story short, what I'm particularly interested in perhaps hearing a little more from you is, how do you sort of see yourself within this kind of question, the sort of the way in which we can, if that makes any sense, relate to something which has been happening, which has happened, and which we try to recover. One of the frustrations of working with, for instance, classical works, but actually this applies to anything coming from the past, is that we hardly manage to get to the original, right? I mean, the original doesn't exist, and I think your argument here is that the original, whatever that is, didn't even exist at the time when we think it existed, and this, of course, makes our work with materials from the past extremely hard, frustrating, but also I see the potential of this frustration as something which can be transformed, metamorphosed into something productive. And so I'm wondering whether you have thoughts about this question. You mentioned originality a few times with different meanings. Your use of Levi-Strauss is, to my mind, extremely convincing, and I was very glad you brought it up here. There's no originality in culture. That was another important statement among the many you were sort of summarizing here, and so I'm just curious to perhaps stimulate you on this question of past and present. Of course, you have brought us into the future, and the question of originality. How do you handle this concept, which of course is very problematic and slippery?
So first of all, thank you a lot for the comments. I don't know if I'm able to give you proper answer to these huge questions. I would stay humble and perhaps try to give answers, first of all, from a purely biographical point of view. As I said at the beginning, I always have this impression. Perhaps this is what I mean. This is why I'm old. Or because I'm old, when I'm looking back to my future, or my childhood or adolescence, I always, see literally an old friend that you like, it's out of sight since decades, but you don't want to connect again with this guy. So it's like you have a beautiful memory, but please don't go dinner. Don't have a dinner again. So it's so, but it's, joke apart, but I think there is a huge misunderstanding in what we call, in this kind of feeling of belonging in the past. First of all, physically, ontologically, biologically, it's not true. The past is like, once it's past, it's belonging to everybody because it's a ruin. So it's a space which everybody can enter and made out of them. That's why there is always fights about who is doing what with the past of a people, of a culture, and so on. But the main point, I would say, is to stress that our place, our house, where we belong, is not the past. Our foods are in the future. So it's like actually every community's house, every community's place is the future. So it's like, and the future which is not even linked with the present. Normally, you know that there is this, there is a huge difference between like the tomorrow, so which is the kind of future which is produced by what is present today, and the day after tomorrow, which is the future you cannot just draw logically from what is present today. So it's like pure, I don't know, something you cannot anticipate. This is the place where every form of community and every form of cultures, this is the source of culture, not the past. The past is just like, the past is like the stars that you're looking at the sky. You can project on them stories, but those stories are never, ever telling you the nature of the stars. They are telling what you are projecting on the past. So from this point of view, it's like it has always been like that. Just take the example of Florence in Renaissance. Literally, this very beautiful joke by McLuhan, the famous media theorician, who really described Renaissance. He was a big specialist of Renaissance, by the way. It was not like a... and he said, like, suddenly 4 people started to wear like garments, like the kind of visual sources they saw, and they started to think that they were Greeks. But it's, first of all, we would name this attitude today cultural appropriation, because it was literally that. But they changed through this, but what they produced, it was not a return to the past. They produced a very strange hybrid culture, which is like, Florence and Rome at the time. So this, I would say, concerning the past. The other question was originality. I don't know, it's, first of all, originality is always, you can baptize an object as original only when it has produced already a copy. Otherwise, it makes no sense to say. So that's what but that's the proof that originality is nothing but a relation between multiple versions. And it's, and you are a philologist, you know very well that unless you are, a strictly libertarian, actually, the question is not the original. It's what can justify the multiplicity of versions that a text has produced. That's the point for historiography anyway. It's not really to touch the mythical original element, is how can you justify the fact that this text has produced so many versions? That is what you are doing when you're doing like a philological kind of.
I mean, this is so
edition.
beautifully put, and really, this is something which I think is at the core of what philology is and should be. Of course, I think there's a huge, widespread misunderstanding in general about what philology is, and this is the fault of many philologists, honestly, who, for, a very long time have reduced philology to this kind of almost useless exercise of, attaining the original which doesn't exist. And I agree with you. I mean, I personally find that the interest of philological work has to do with the long tradition of text. Of course, even the word tradition is laden with problematic meanings. But let's keep it for a second. The idea that a text traveling in time has been copied, has been in the hands of people who have done things with it, and it has changed. It has metamorphosed, and to my mind, what is interesting in the life of a text is really this going through time and space, right?
No, but also because we totally forget that, I mean, not here because you are all specialists of literature and so on, but we forget the material condition of text. I mean, and originality is a concept that made sense in the 1780s century culture, where a majority in print, but it makes no sense to speak of originality in Middle Ages, where texts were written on manuscripts. So it's like today. I don't know how it works with you, but when I'm writing a book, I'm putting very stupid names like a version. First version, second version, but then it's impossible, and I make at least, even for an essay, 15 versions of the same text, and sometimes the changes are very, very small, and one year afterwards to really understand why I put this version as number 1, the other as number 2 is totally so. It because of the materiality of media, this concept of originality, I think even today, it's less significant than it used to be in a culture that was defined by print, text. Today, I mean, for instance, it makes no sense to speak of originality in social media or in the digital space, because it's really nonsensical today, and perhaps we should overcome this kind of issues.
Which actually works so well with what you were saying earlier about the way in which mythological narratives work. This idea of a shared kind of knowledge which changes shape while, moving from one narrator to another. I think there was a very beautiful quote in one of your slides, which of course I'm not able to find right now, but the kind of question of what happens when the same story moves from someone to someone else and they tell it in a different way, yet the story is the same. And this is really what mythology, in a way, is all about. And I guess that the point which you were just making now about the permeability of media or mediums, even in today's communication, is crucial to this notion of something which is out there, which belongs to everybody in a way, and which gets to be told, retold, narrated in different ways. Again, the notion of metamorphosis comes up.
But it's also, sorry, just because it's interesting perhaps to speak about that, but then perhaps we could change. But why originality makes no sense in the media, in the contemporary media landscape? Because it's exactly like in Middle Ages, there is no distinction, real distinction or material distinction between the writer and the publisher. Whenever you are posting something on Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or Redbook, whatever, all those, you are at the same time the writer and the publisher. And there is no more distinction. When this distinction, falls apart, then of course there is no, because the originality, the condition of possibility of originality is a material form of circulation of culture where publishers are formally and ontologically distinguished by the writers, which is possible just in printed culture. Else, in oral culture, in manuscript cultures, in digital culture, this distinction don't exist, cannot exist, and that's why originality is no more an issue.
Yeah, no, but this is very true. Let me move on to a different question, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. Thank you for bringing up the Marsilio Ficino quote. I hope you won't mind if I sort of cherry pick here the sort of little Renaissance reference there. That quote is very beautiful, and it also made me think about something which you haven't touched upon, but which I know you have given a lot of thought to, which is the question of course, the other Ovid. You brought up the ars amatoria, and thank you for doing that, because I think the argument about ars amatoria as the technology of love really reminds us what the real meaning of ars in a pre-romantic world is. But then I was thinking the quote from Marsilio Ficino, amans amanti figuram suo sculpit in animo, so the idea of the lover who sculpts, who carves the image, the figura of the beloved in their soul, made me think that the word animus is what really opens the Metamorphoses by Ovid, right? And I think at the very beginning of the Metamorphoses, Ovid says, I want to speak about the bodies changed into new forms, but what the Latin has is in nova fert animus mutatas dicere formas corpora. So the idea is that this sort of spring of narrative force comes out of animus, which of course within the world of Ovid's Metamorphoses has a peculiar meaning, very different from other contexts, and probably different from what Ficino had in mind when he was using the word animus. But my kind of connection here, thinking of what's happening around us, has to do with the other term involved in this reflection, which is anima. Of course, animus and anima, and you know all this better than I do, because as a medievalist by training, I'm sure you have been spending a time on this distinction. But anima is of course soul, and soul came up in your talk several times. The other day, I went to see the Caspar David Friedrich exhibit up at the Metropolitan Museum, the title of which is The Soul of Nature, which of course, it's a little kind of a, easy title in a way, very catchy, but also very, very profound. It has soul, anima, it has nature. Hearing you talk about soul and also about animus when you brought up Marsilio Ficino, I saw even more clearly the kind of deep argument you make in the book about the connection among things in the world, which I think, of course, is an argument with many important repercussions, also at a political kind of level, as you gestured towards at the end of your talk. So again, this is more of a comment than a question, sort of a suggestion here to, if you want to share something about these, animus, anima, the idea of narration and narrative coming from within. Again, I think of Ovid, but the concept might apply to other authors as well. And I know that, of course, you are doing this work, primarily as a philosopher, but you are also a reader of texts. And, I would love to hear about your take on this particular question, which Ovid brings up at the very beginning of the Metamorphoses.
I don't know if I'm able to take up this question, and it would need like days, but and people wanna have dinner, I think, today, not tomorrow. So no, but concerning Ovid, just perhaps. Perhaps I will just spend a word not on the beginning but on the end. So what was important for my book and from my training was the 15th book of the Metamorphosis, which is, I don't know if you ever read it, it's like a very strange cosmological treatise where Ovid is trying to he speaks, about Pythagorean, but he's trying to prove the reality of reincarnation. So, which is the very ultimate reason why every form is transforming. It's following in because actually souls are passing from one body to body, from one species to species, and so on. And it's a very beautiful passage. That, by the way, this is the reason for them, for Ovid and for ancient Pythagoreans, why you should not eat animals, because if you are eating a cow, that's your dead uncle. So it's it's very. But in the book, I don't have time and wanted to stress it. But in the book, I really try to translate this theory in a contemporary one. How can we think about reincarnation today in a literal sense? There is a very stupid and basic biological level, which is every time that we are eating something, we are normally considering eating, because we are coming from a Christian tradition, but we consider eating as a form of sacrifice. But it's not true, because it's just the half of the truth that you are like killing a living being in order to survive. What is happening is that each time that we are eating, we are searching for the life of the other living being, not for the energy. Because if we would search for the energy, we just would need to put our hands in socket and in the electric socket and at dinner and lunch. But we need this life, and each act of eating is the evidence of the fact that my life and the life of a tomato is exactly the same. That's why, in order to survive, I have to eat a tomato or a cow or I don't know, whatever. So because it's exactly the same life, and what happens every time that we are eating is the fact that the life of the tomato is like reincarnating. Literally, the body of the tomato is reincarnating in my body, and I'm half human and half tomato, or half human and half cows. And that is what is happening literally in every process, in every form of nutrition. So it's, in a way, what is difficult is not to prove that on the level of the body, it's more on the level of psychology. But I think that in a way, and it's not even so difficult to prove it, what Freud used to call the identification was also a form of theory of reincarnation in psychological terms. Every time that we are loving someone, we are identifying with someone, and in a way, this someone is also reincarnating in us as a static form. Of course, it's not evolving. It's what also Psycho. Do you remember the film? It's like trying to describe in a way. So that's what. But I prefer to speak about like the last book than the first lines of the Metamorphosis.
Yeah, well, thank you, Emanuele. I think we should really, make the most of Emanuele's being here for opening it up to questions from the audience, because I have many more, but I want to stop here and make room for questions. We have a microphone around, so don't be shy, and
You're hungry when I eat.
well, you have been talking about cows and tomatoes, and okay, one question. I just 1 second for the microphone, because we have people watching from home.
I have actually 2 questions, but I will be quick because there's been too much talking about food. The first one is about the fact that your book came out in 2020, which was a year in which we all became very painfully aware of proximity with others. And I suppose your book was already in production when the pandemic started, but I was wondering if somehow prompt you to rethink what you wrote in your book about Metamorphosis. And the second question is about how do you position your work as a philosopher? Because reading your book, which I loved very much, I was reminded of the work of a philosopher like Donna Haraway with her idea of the companion species, or Zerilli-Marimo. So I was curious if in the chain of this of knowledge, of original, or in the conversation that I guess every book join, which philosophers in the field of environmental humanities you were thinking of, or if you are even familiar with them.
Hey, so thank you so much. Concerning the first question about the date of when the book came out, actually it was the day when bookstores were closed. So and it was so funny because actually so when I say that it's difficult for me to speak about past books because I don't remember nothing that what I'm writing, so I had really to read, and I'm always astonished by but there was a passage, I don't remember which passage, but I remember that there was like 3 pages where I described the future as a virus. In positive sense. So, and when like in Europe, people started to speak about this pandemic, I was like, oh my God, what did I do? Why did I write this? Everybody will hate me. And so I couldn't sleep for like 3 weeks. And I saw the fact that the book was like in the bookstores when bookstores were closed as a sort of like, yeah, it was the sort of punishment, the right punishment for my hubris. But no, I was not influenced by the pandemic to see back like whatever. First of all, because I never look back. That's the problem that I have probably. From a psychological point of view, but it is because during this period, I had a huge anxiety because I decided to write a book about homes. And I don't know if you can conceive how, to be in the lockdown, to be obliged to stay at home for like 4 months and to be obliged to work on homes, it's the perfect definition of hell. So I was like so anxious about why did I choose this topics, and I didn't just to write about, I don't know, the space of like the sea, something that at least let my imagination like go far away. So concerning the second point, it's quite difficult because you named Don Haraway. I'm teaching this kind of text. Last year I did a class on the title was A Talmudic Commentary on Donna Haraway, because students have so many difficulties to understand, to read her books, that I made like in Middle Ages. One sentence is like the Bible, one sentence and then commentary. So I'm reading a lot, but I would say that for me, since I had this very strong, I'm reading a lot everything, so I'm trying to really I'm very bulimic. But for me, the ideas start always from real biological research. So since I was like trained in like botany or biology when I was a kid or almost a kid, I was always, it's also there in time that my questions were raised. So when I was obliged to think about plants every single day, even if I wanted to like study Latin or something else. I think that there is, and in a way, those kind of books, now I'm not writing anymore on those topics, but those kind of books were also for me an attempt to show that if you're taking literally, and if you're really accepting what science says, you are obliged to consider science as the most the craziest and the most lethargic form of science fiction that our culture, produce. Because, if you, every kind handbook of botany starts by saying, yeah, it's because of plants that you can live on this planet, but literally it means that plants are goddesses. They are like the demiurges and so on. So my idea was really, when I wrote this book, let's take literally sentences from science. In the case of what's the name of the book? Metamorphosis was entomology. Let's take what entomologists today are saying about metamorphosis, which, because they are saying crazy stuff, like they are saying that it's like as if one individual is producing the egg that allowed this individual to come out of the mother. So it's like, but let's take that seriously, and just let's use more comprehensible language, and show that science is a form of like lethargic, visionary form of contemplation of reality. So that's
Hi, thank you for the talk, and certainly the visuals were very appealing, and I was wondering if you could...
Sorry, I cannot hear you.
Oh, okay, I'll speak louder. The visuals during your talk were very appealing, and I was wondering if you could elaborate a little on how the aesthetics of metamorphosis materialize in your everyday life, etc. Thank you.
Thank you for the appreciation of the slides. I spent not hours, days making slides. It's what I
feel guilty.
love the most. But it's difficult to answer. It's a very beautiful answer, but it's difficult for me to, or perhaps not, because I was about to say it's difficult to give an answer, because I'm changing my daily life very, very frequently. But perhaps it's that. In the sense, first of all, I'm moving a lot. I'm like, in the last 3 months, I moved already 3-4 times. So it's, and also the days are not like, every day is totally different. So it's already that it's embodying the aesthetic of metamorphosis. Otherwise, I don't think that that there is a style, that you cannot translate this kind of ideas into a specific style. And in a way, butterflies are the evidence of that, because if you think about that, butterflies like just take the occasion of like just change this life of a caterpillar, but then the style of butterflies is infinite. There is no just one style. Butterflies can change. So that's the point. When you're accepting metamorphosis, every single like aesthetical criterion is like possible, becomes possible. I don't know if I rightly understood your answer, and I give you good.
I think there's two questions from the first row. So Emily, the mic is arriving. Yeah.
Thank you, Emanuele. That was always so provocative. I wanted to push something which is, I think, a kind of radical dispossessiveness. You could almost say a dispossessive collectivism in the vision that is pushing back against kinds of nominalisms, taxonomies, the way in which things get separated and classified. And of course, the example of philology that Eugenio brought up is the complicated one. What would be a metamorphic approach to languaging? That's something that interests me a lot. If you just, and I've been thinking a lot about language as a dialectal continua, where you simply have these artificial stops on the path, more than I've been thinking about, say, the metamorphic as the driver of languaging. But so it's really an invitation to have some more thoughts about where, when you talked about in a sense, the arbitrariness of national language names and the way we approach linguistic history, which is full of marking differences, how would you push this in the other direction fully? What would be a metamorphic approach to philology fully?
Yeah, very difficult question. Thank you. Very beautiful question. Yeah, first of all, I would say if you put the question in philological terms, everything depends from the media you are speaking about. Because, I mean, for instance, for me, it would be interesting today to speak about what could be baptized as a form of philology of the digital space, because it's not, because in that case you do not have originals. It makes no sense. You have a huge proliferation of things. To think archives in this space is extremely difficult because they are already structured as archives, but archives that are no more there in order to be really consulted, or not in the same way you are going in a library. So from this point of view, I think we have already something which is the implementation of metamorphosis in the life of speaking, let's say, language, because this space, I don't know where is my, yeah, this space is a the metamorphic space par excellence. In terms, first of all, because it's like par excellence, it's not a space which can be really project or in a way reflect the geography, the physical geography of nations. I mean, because it's there is no space, it's another idea of space, and because everything is changing here. So in a way, we already produced a space where literatures, discourses, languages are changing constantly. Also because it's a very beautiful, very interesting space where, in a way, writings has the same or occupies the same place that orality occupies in our life. So this space, whenever we are writing here, we are, how can I say, twisting writings with the same force of violence that normally orality, with orality treats languages. So that's why it's more interesting to ask the questions you just asked me in this space, because in an oral culture you cannot like trace changes. Here there is a sort of typographical trace of everything which is changing in languages, even the expression, even the way to say I don't know, thank you, or which is now a couple of characters which cannot even be produced. This is also beautiful. I was always like, this is a very nerdy joke, but what we call emoticon, or what we call when we thank someone with like a colon emoji, yeah, those kind of like text are texts that cannot be read. You can write it, but you cannot read it. And this is the definition of the name of God in Jewish culture. So it's so interesting. What this object are doing to our literary, philosophical, or linguistic traditions. And I think that your question is important because it's the key in order to try to understand what is happening here. I don't know if it was...
So you have one final question.
So I wanted, thank you so much. That was so fun to follow, and the images were so fun to look at too. So I wanted to know why you never mentioned poetics, because it feels
Poetics?
Yeah,
What do you mean?
like a making, to me, like sex and poetics kind of become the same thing. And I'm thinking of like even the Old English term kenning, the way that kenning is a bringing together of two things, that metamorphoses a word, and kenning is also about kin and sex and generative force. So it feels like there's a generative force but I was wondering why you might consciously avoid that term.
I mean, I don't know because I never thought about that, but probably because everybody's speaking about poetics and no, in order to be in order to give you perhaps a serious answer, perhaps the reason why I unconsciously avoided this term is that when you are speaking about poetics, you are, I mean, unconsciously, implicitly referring to a kind of extremely rare process or act, which is not like, which doesn't coincide with the very simple fact of living. And I was trying to speak about like something which coincides with the act of breathing. So it's so that's, of course it's the same, but I didn't want probably to name it with this name, because otherwise you are still referring to something which is very elitist or very rare. Just a couple of, because it's also, I think personally that it's not true that every human being is a poet. Very, very few human beings are poets or artists. It's really difficult to be artist. I mean, and there are very few artists, I mean, in a time, in a space. So that's why I think it's not the appropriate term, because what I'm thinking about or what I'm speaking about is something which is, as birth, as I said, universal, the most universal phenomenon that characterize living beings.
Right, so on this note, I think that it's time for tomatoes or cows or whatever you guys eat. And I would like to thank Emanuele again.
Thank you.
And thank you all for being with us tonight.